Good day. Today is Saturday, 17th May 2025, and before proceeding with the substance of this program, I should quickly say that tomorrow and for the next 3 days I shall be out of the country. In fact, I shall be in St. Petersburg in Russia. First time I have visited Russia for 7 years, and the first time I have visited St. Petersburg since May 2016. So it's a long time since I have been there. I'm attending a legal conference. There will be people there discussing various legal topics. I was invited to attend by the organizers, one of whom I understand is a member of the Russian Constitutional Court. I was very happy to accept the invitation. It will be my first opportunity to see St. Petersburg, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and to see Russia again, as I said, for 7 years, and to reacquaint myself with the situation there. Now, that inevitably, however, means that I'm going to be affected by the way I do programs. Firstly, I am not completely sure how straightforward the internet situation is in Russia. I've made various arrangements. I hope that I will be able to do videos without interference or without any problems from then. Interference, obviously, I don't expect interference, but there might be technical problems, though I'm confident, if there are, that I will be able to address them. Secondly, it is likely, given that I will be attending a forum, the legal forum, for the full 2 days that I will be in St. Petersburg and in Russia, it is very likely that my videos on those days will be much shorter than usual. Lastly, and of course, on Sunday and on Wednesday, I am travelling. I'm travelling on Sunday from London to St. Petersburg, and on Wednesday from St. Petersburg to London. And unfortunately, because of the various problems with flights, these are long and very complicated journeys, and I can't be certain at what time I will be able to do programs. Just saying. But anyway, I will do my absolute best to continue the stream of videos that I do every day. But if there are problems, well, please forgive me in advance. My apologies in advance. Those are the reasons. As I said, this is an opportunity to see what is actually happening in Russia and to participate, by the way, in a very interesting legal forum, an opportunity to see Russia and to participate in that forum, which I absolutely, obviously could not pass up. So there may be some of these problems, but anyway, if there are, I will no doubt be able to find ways around them. But in any event, I would ask for your forbearance in advance. Anyway, with that, let us now proceed with the substance of this program, of today's program. And the starting point has to be the meeting which took place in Istanbul yesterday between the Russian delegation led by Vladimir Medinsky and the Ukrainian delegation led by Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umarov. Meeting that took place in the Dolmabahce Palace in Istanbul. The first direct meeting between the Russians and the Ukrainians since the collapse of the Istanbul process that took place in April 2022. And I think before I start with a discussion, I think the first thing to say is that however one packages the events of the last week, there is absolutely no doubt who the winner has been, who has won hands down in the complex, intricate game of poker, that diplomatic poker that was played over the course of the last week. That winner is Vladimir Putin and Russia. Vladimir Putin and the Russians have been saying ever since April 2022 that they're ready for direct negotiations with the Ukrainians. They want to resume the negotiations that were interrupted in Istanbul in April 2022. They have always said that they want to have negotiations take place. And incidentally, and for the record, they also say that there is no need for a ceasefire before negotiations take place. And in fact, they don't think a ceasefire prior to negotiations taking place is a good idea, given Ukraine's previous propensity not to honour terms of ceasefires and to make use of ceasefires to its own advantage. Now, on this point, by the way, no less than the head of the Russian delegation, Mr. Medinsky, who is, of course, a historian. There's some people in the West who want to cast doubt on how good a historian he is. As I've read none of his books, I'm not going to comment on that. And besides, I don't think it is a relevant issue in this discussion. But anyway, Mr. Medinsky, who is a historian, gave an interview to Russia 1 television station in which he made the same point that I have made in many, many programs, that it is much more usual in conflicts of this kind for negotiations to take place, which might eventually lead to a ceasefire, than for there to be a ceasefire before negotiations begin. And there's a quotation of what Medinsky said from TASS, and I will just quote it because it seems to me it is absolutely on all fours with the historical facts. As Napoleon said, as a rule, war and negotiations always proceed side by side. The Vietnam War, talks between the United States and Vietnam continued throughout the conflict. The Korean War, negotiations continued amid hostilities. If we look at the 20th century, the Soviet-Finnish War is a perfect example. History tends to repeat itself. It's quite remarkable. Stalin offered a truce to Finland, an armistice, while the British and French told Finland to hold out. Don't negotiate with the Soviets. Don't sign a peace deal. We will provide you with military aid. Volunteer expeditionary forces will arrive. Fight the Russians to the last Finn. I'm not saying, by the way, that Medinsky is characterising what the British and the French were telling the Finns at that time correctly. I don't know the history. But anyway, he goes on. Yet even as fighting continued, peace talks were underway, and in the end, those talks led to a peace agreement, which brought the conflict to a close. My point is, throughout history, war and negotiations have always happened at the same time. I think he's right. Now, I'm not saying that we've never had situations where there have been ceasefires before negotiations begin, but I think that is very, very much the exception. What Medinsky is saying here, I think, comes closest to the historical record. You have a conflict, the conflict goes on, talks begin. As the parties move forward with the talks, as it begins to seem as if they're likely to reach some kind of an agreement, the first step they take on the way to that agreement is to agree the terms of a ceasefire. I'm not saying that there has never been, in recorded history, a single case where there's been a ceasefire first and then talks. I'm sure if you scrabble around and search, you will probably find examples where that happened. But it is not by any means the most usual way in which wars end. Mostly the negotiations begin and lead to the ceasefire and then the final settlement and not the other way round. On this issue, at least, Mr. Medinsky knows his history. Anyway, the Russians said that they wanted direct talks with the Ukrainians to begin, and they were not going to start those talks after a ceasefire was agreed, because if that were to happen on the basis of the previous history, the Ukrainians would spin out the talks indefinitely. The talks would lead to no sort of conclusion, and the Ukrainians would use the ceasefire in the meantime to reorganize, reinforce, re-equip, and prepare for the next round of the war. So that was the Russian position, and this week, they won the point. There is no ceasefire, and notwithstanding that, direct negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians have begun. Moreover, the Ukrainians have passed an edict, a law, a decree, whatever it is, supposedly prohibiting themselves from engaging the Russians in negotiations. And, well, that edict, law, decree, whatever it is, has now been cast to one side. We see that the Ukrainians, despite the existence of that decree, are now sitting down and talking to the Russians. So the Russians have won conclusively this particular argument. They've got direct negotiations. There is no ceasefire. The Ukrainians rejected direct negotiations without a ceasefire. They are nonetheless now sitting down and negotiating with the Russians despite the terms of their own decree. Now, what the Ukrainians propose to do with their decree, I think is actually a serious point which needs to be addressed at some point in the near future. Do they leave that decree in place, which might ultimately cast a question mark on all of the discussions that are taking place in Istanbul? Might it not be the case that at some point in the future, someone in Ukraine will say that the talks in Istanbul have no legal validity because they are taking place without a proper legal basis, because they are prohibited by the decree? I am confident that sooner or later the question of the decree will come up and that the Russians will insist that it must be rescinded, and I suspect that they will get support for that position from the United States. But anyway, for the moment at least, it is the Ukrainians who've had to pull back, they've had to retreat, they've had to agree to direct negotiations, which they didn't want to agree to without a ceasefire. And there is no ceasefire. And despite their decree, and despite all of those things, the direct talks have taken place. The New York Times has acknowledged that the Russians have won this round, and they are obviously right. Now, this may not have huge significance going forward. It could be that everything reverses again in some way, that the Ukrainians pull out of the process, that the Americans become exasperated with the Russians. Who knows? But I think it is worth saying at this stage that at this point the Russians have won an important point and are decisively ahead on points. Now, there is a narrative that is there all across the media and which Zelensky himself has been busy promoting over the last few hours, which is that because the delegation that went to Istanbul from Russia was so weak and underpowered and so poorly led, because none of the people on that delegation had a mandate to agree anything, because the Russians made extraordinary and extravagant and unreasonable demands over the course of the 2-hour meeting. Nothing was achieved. The whole negotiation, every single part of what happened in Istanbul was a complete failure. And, well, the Russians supposedly are to blame for that. And, of course, Zelensky, who is now in Tirana, or at least went to Tirana yesterday, where he met with his dear friends, Macron, Starmer, Merz, Tusk, all of them. They're all in Tirana at the moment. Anyway, Zelensky, of course, has been repeating this point relentlessly, and it's been taken up by the media in the West relentlessly, and it is what you read in every place, that these were inconsequential talks, that this is all theatre, that it was meaningless, that nothing productive or important actually took place. And I have to say that there are some people on what I would call independent media who take the same view. I have to say that I don't actually fully agree with this. I think that clearly, even though the talks only lasted for 2 hours, some things were achieved, and I will say very briefly, firstly, what they were. Now, for starters, there is some argument as to what language the Ukrainians spoke during the negotiation. Prior to the start of the negotiation, the Ukrainians, certainly in the public part and the introductory comment, were talking in Ukrainian. All the Ukrainian representatives, of course, speak Russian. I suspect that in many cases it is their first language. But in their first introductory comments, they definitely spoke Ukrainian. And the official position is that the Ukrainians stuck to Ukrainian throughout the entire 2 hours of the meeting. However, Ukrainian commentators in Ukraine itself, including one whose name I believe, from memory, is Goncharenko, who I believe is quite a heavyweight commentator. Anyway, they are saying that as soon as the Turks and the others left the room, as soon as the television cameras left the room, the entire discussion continued with both sides talking to the other in Russian. So it could be that that is what happened. And I have to say, if that was the case, it again suggests that the balance of advantage over the course of this meeting did tilt further towards the Russian side. Now, there have been many accounts about what happened over the course of this meeting. All of these accounts, bar a brief statement from Medinsky, have come from the Ukrainian side. And I think that is a point that everybody needs to understand. Some Russians, like Margarita Simonian, have come forward and have given their own accounts, which appear to be based on sources. But mostly it is the Ukrainians who have been telling us what took place over the course of this meeting. Nonetheless, I think we can get a fair idea of what did take place, because I noticed that the Russians are not contradicting what the Ukrainians said. Firstly, let us go to what was publicly agreed, and this has been confirmed in a short statement by Medinsky, the head of the Russian delegation. The Ukrainians have also confirmed it, and there is no doubt about this because this has been stated publicly. The first point of agreement was that there was to be a big prisoner exchange. 1,000 Ukrainian prisoners would be handed over by the Russians in return for 1,000 Russian prisoners being handed over to the Russians by the Ukrainians. Prisoner exchanges have happened throughout the war. This is a bigger one than usual, but there have been other pretty big ones as well. And this is a prisoner exchange that has been agreed. The second is that the two parties did agree to exchange written ideas about what a future ceasefire might look like. And Medinsky confirmed this, and the Ukrainians have confirmed this as well. Thirdly, it has been agreed by both sides that there will be follow-up talks, probably in June, also probably in Istanbul at the Dolmabahce Palace. I understand that the Americans will not be involved in those discussions. That's what we know was agreed. So clearly we are at the start of a process. But as I said, we've now been getting a lot of information about what took place over the course of the meeting itself. So firstly, the Ukrainians came into the meeting with the mandate they were given by Zelensky, and they demanded an immediate, unconditional 30-day ceasefire. The Russians said no. They said they were not prepared to agree to an immediate, unconditional 30-day ceasefire. The Russians said that as a minimum condition for a ceasefire, the Ukrainians needed to withdraw from the four regions, from Zaporozhye, Kherson, those parts of Donetsk that they still control, and the few remaining kilometers of Lugansk region that they also still control. The last apparently being mostly uninhabited. So the Russians said that that was the minimum that they would agree to, that they would require in order for a ceasefire to be agreed. The Ukrainians pushed back. They said that this demand was unmoored to reality, that Ukraine was in control of this territory, that the Russians couldn't be serious about demanding that Ukraine withdraw from territory that it already controlled in return for a ceasefire. And then the Russians snapped back and said that unless that happened, unless Ukraine did withdraw from the four regions, and by the way, eventually recognized the four regions as Russian, then the war would go on, and the Russians eventually would occupy more territory beyond those four regions, and would begin to demand that all of that additional territory be admitted by Ukraine to be Russian as well. Now, there is some conflict here about what exactly it was that the Russians said they might seek in addition to the four regions if their demand that the Ukrainians withdraw from the four regions were not accepted. The Ukrainians are saying that the Russians would basically told them that if the Ukrainians did not withdraw from the four regions, the Russians ultimately would be taking 5. The Russians are saying it differently, and here I'm going to read out what Margarita Simonian said, and this is, I believe, said on X. Story has been making rounds that Ukrainians were outraged when Russian negotiators said that Ukrainian soldiers must leave the 4 new Russian regions as part of the ceasefire, to which the Moscow delegation replied, next time it will be 5. Our reporter, and she's a member of the Russia Сегодня organization, and which includes the news agency Novosti and the heavily sanctioned television channel which he heads. Our reporter in Istanbul got to ask the Russian side how it really went down. We didn't say 5, and this is a quote, supposedly, from one of the Russian negotiators. We didn't say 5, we said 8. 8. Now, that obviously includes, as well as the 4 regions, plus Crimea, it must include Sumy, Dnipro, Chernigov, Kharkiv, Poltava region, as well as Nikolaev region, Odessa, all of these places. All of these Russian-speaking, historically Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine. The Ukrainians have been put on notice that if they don't agree to a ceasefire, if they don't agree to the Russian terms, then they will lose most of their country, or at least half of their country, but by far the most productive and the most urbanized, and I believe the most populous part. So, very tough demand, and that would include, by the way, just to say, obviously the loss of Odessa and Nikolaev and Ukraine's entire Black Sea coast. I believe it would mean loss of nearly all of the famous Black Earth region, the enormously rich agricultural region that Ukraine controls. It would mean loss of still more of the natural resources, the rare earths, well, not rare earths so much, but lithium deposits, natural gas deposits, and all of those things which Ukraine has just signed an agreement about with the United States. The Russians are giving the Ukrainians notice that this is the risk they run if they continue to hold out and delay agreeing peace by rejecting Russian terms. And the Ukrainians apparently then said that this is completely unreasonable, that there is still a war going on. For the Russians to take all of this territory might take years. And allegedly, and apparently this is, when I say allegedly, it's largely accepted that he did say it. Medinsky, again, demonstrating that he is a historian, he said that Russia, if it needed to, would go for as long as it takes. It might be 1, 2, 3, 5, 10 years. Russia fought the Great Northern War, the war that Peter the Great fought and won against Sweden. That lasted for 21 years. Why do the Ukrainians assume that the fact that it might take the Russians some more time to capture this territory? Why do they assume that the Russians lack the will and the capacity to do it? Very much, again, the sort of reply that you would get from a historian, which is what Medinsky is. So, apparently, according to the Ukrainian leaks, the Russians also made various other further demands. They demanded that Ukraine must once again go back to what it agreed in Istanbul in April 2022, which is that it not join NATO, that in fact it make provisions that it never join NATO. And apparently the Russians brought up the provisions of the Austrian State Treaty that was agreed in, I believe, 1955 between the Soviet Union, Austria, and the Western powers, whereby the Soviets, the Austrians, and the Western powers agreed that Austria would remain permanently neutral and would never join NATO. That treaty, by the way, is still in effect, so that though Austria is a member of the European Union, it is not and cannot be a member of NATO. Anyway, notice that this is a treaty which was entered into by the Soviet Union, Austria, and the Western powers. So if the Russians are bringing up the Austrian formula, then they presumably are saying that not only must the Ukraine agree that it will never join NATO, but there have to be treaty commitments by the Western powers that Ukraine not join NATO also. A fresh demand that goes well beyond what the Russians sought in Istanbul in April 2022. And alongside that, there were all the provisions that one might expect about protections for Russian citizens in Ukraine. The Russians, somewhat cheekily, but very understandably, said that Ukraine must agree to protections for Russians, identical to the protections that the various European Union provisions for protections of the rights of minorities set out. The European Union, by the way, is very patchy in terms of enforcing that in terms of its own territory. It doesn't always go through with its supposed protections of minorities. But never mind, the Russians want the Ukrainians to commit at least to that. And the Russians also want steps to be taken, as they've always said, to shut down the entire Bandera movement, the nationalist movement in Ukraine, which the Russians also, of course, discussed and insisted upon at the time of the Istanbul Agreement of April 2022. Now, the Ukrainians, and as I said, we're getting all of this information from the Ukrainians, have not mentioned whether the Russians also brought up limits on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. But given how tough all of Russia's other positions, other demands are turning out to be, I think it is inconceivable that the Russians did not bring that up also. So the Russians not only are sticking with Istanbul Plus, they are making it clear to the Ukrainians that they will insist on Istanbul Plus, and that unless Istanbul Plus is accepted in full by the Ukrainians, Istanbul Plus being what Putin proposed in his speech to the Foreign Ministry of 14th June 2024, if the Ukrainians don't agree to all of that, to the whole package, then the Russians will continue the war. They will continue it for as long as it takes. They will take, at the very least, 8 regions as opposed to 4, leaving Ukraine as a rump state. And, well, it might even conceivably, I suppose, go beyond that as well. So an absolutely uncompromising message from the Russians to the Ukrainians. So that was apparently what passed at this meeting. And interestingly, and in spite of all of that, it seems that the Ukrainians took it all very calmly. There were no raised voices. There was, in fact, some humour. The Russians apparently were laughing at one particular point in response to one of the points that the Ukrainians were making. As I said, if Mr. Goncharenko, and I gather it is Mr. Goncharenko in Ukraine, is telling the truth, the entire conversation took place in Russian. I'm not saying that the Ukrainians are going to agree to the Russian proposals, but the Russians have made their proposals. And that brings us back to the one point of agreement, which is that each side has said that it will present to the other their own conceptions of what a ceasefire will look at. Well, the Russians have already told us what it will look like. They say that as a minimum, it must include Ukrainian withdrawal from the 4 regions. What the Ukrainians are going to say, I don't know. But anyway, that apparently is what the Russians are going to say. In fact, they've already said that it is what they're going to say. Probably there will be much more. There will be provisions for monitoring the ceasefire. There will be further provisions for preventing Ukraine from receiving new weapons. And it'll be the Ukrainians who will be expected to agree to that, by the way. And for Ukraine not receiving any further intelligence from the Western powers. So I expect all of that to be in the Russian proposal. We will see what, if anything, is in the Ukrainian one. Now, there was one other demand that the Russians did apparently make over the course of the meeting yesterday. And that is that not only should Ukraine withdraw from the 4 regions, the entirety of the 4 regions, including the cities of Kherson and Zaporozhye, but the Ukrainians should also formally recognize these 4 territories as Russian, as well as Crimea as Russian, and should not prevent, or should take no steps to prevent other countries from recognizing these territories also. And I'm going to say here that if that happens, if the Ukrainians do, in some unlikely but perhaps not impossible reality, reach that point when they do recognize Crimea and the rest of the 4 regions as Russian, then I fully expect a cascade of countries will come forward and do so as well. One of the most interesting things, and I say this now purely as an aside, is that over the last few months I've been following the Indian media much more closely than I used to do. This is the result of the proliferation of Indian television channels and the way in which Indian newspapers now regularly have channels of their own on YouTube. And I've been reading and I've been following what these channels say. And I notice that over the last few months, there has been a significant shift, or so at least it seems to me, a significant shift in Indian coverage of the conflict in Ukraine. Whereas, say, a year or so ago, the Indian media, tended to be very even-handed in the way it covered the war. Now, they are becoming increasingly obviously more weighted in favor of the Russians. And I, for one, expect that if Ukraine were to recognize the 4 regions as Russian, India quite plausibly would follow suit and do so as well. I suspect China would. Other countries in the global south probably would. Nobody should be surprised if there is a cascade of countries that do that. And if the United States does that too, and Donald Trump, of course, has hinted as much, he, after all, proposed through his intermediaries in Witkoff and Kellogg that the United States recognize Crimea as Russian and the 4 regions as Russian de facto. Well, it would not surprise me if we have a similar administration, if Trump is still president, if one of the countries that follows suit is the United States as well. Just saying, unlikely though that seems. To reiterate, the Ukrainians, for the moment, are showing no willingness to recognize any of their lost territory as Russian. But as I said, were that to change, I expect that there would be a cascade of countries that would recognize that also. Anyway, those were the Russian demands. They were very tough and very hard line. And I'm going to say something that I have said in previous programs, that despite the appointment of Medinsky as chief negotiator, which carries over from the previous negotiating team the Ukrainians had to deal with in February, March, April 2022. Apart from Medinsky and Alexander Fomin, the Russian military diplomat, who was also a member of the previous delegation and is a member of this delegation also. The new delegation that has been sent to Istanbul is much tougher, much stronger than the earlier delegation. And we're starting to see the effect of that. Apparently, they're saying it as it is. They're being blunt and outspoken, and apparently sometimes humorous in the way they go about setting up their positions. But they're not giving an inch. And for every Ukrainian response, the Russians immediately seem to have their own response. It's clear that they've gamed this very, very carefully, as they have probably been working hard to do over the days preceding the meeting in Istanbul. So anyway, there we go. An incredibly tough line from the Russians. Now, Zelensky went to Tirana. He's met all his good friends there, his European chums. There's even a photograph which I understand was made in Tirana, which shows Zelensky with some of them, including Starmer, by the way, in a room with lots of big windows and foliage behind. I presume this is the meeting in Tirana. I'm not absolutely sure, but I assume it is. Anyway, the media reports in Britain, in Bloomberg, are that the Europeans are now sunk in gloom. Nothing is turning out as they'd expected. This whole complicated poker game that they've been playing, not just over the last week, but basically ever since the disastrous Oval Office meeting, which took place at the end of February between Zelensky, Trump and Vance. The whole poker game, as of this specific moment in time, appears to have failed. They were trying to win Trump over to Ukraine's side. They were working with Kellogg to try to get Trump and the Americans to commit to a ceasefire and to impose massive sanctions on the Russians if the Russians didn't agree to that ceasefire, which of course the Russians have consistently said they were not prepared to do. There's a very interesting article in The Guardian by The Guardian's journalist Sean Walker, which provided a few more details. It confirms, by the way, that the Europeans have been working very closely with Lindsey Graham, who put forward the massive sanctions package, the bone-crunching sanctions package, which supposedly has the support of 72 senators. I never for one moment believed or thought that the Europeans weren't in touch with Lindsey Graham, but it is clear now that they are. So they've been working with Lindsey Graham, they've been working with Kellogg, they've been working, in other words, with the neocons in Washington, and they've been trying to maneuver Trump into a position where he blames Putin for the fact that there isn't a ceasefire and imposes sanctions upon Russia. These Lindsey Graham's sanctions, these bone-crunching sanctions on Russia. And as we know, last week, the Europeans thought they'd got there. And Sean Walker now has some really rather interesting information, which isn't fully consistent with what I previously believed. Now, according to Sean Walker, At no point in time last week did Trump actually say that he was going to impose sanctions on Russia if the Russians didn't agree to an unconditional ceasefire. But the Europeans went around telling everybody that he had done. And the famous telephone call that took place in Ukraine, when the four leaders, Macron, Starmer, Tusk, and Merz, were in Ukraine, the famous telephone call in which the four European leaders plus Zelensky called and spoke to Trump, was unexpected by Trump. Apparently he was asleep when they called and he had to be woken up. So they were talking to a sleepy Trump who perhaps hadn't expected, who obviously hadn't expected, and who probably didn't welcome their call. I wonder whether that was intentional, by the way, just saying. Anyway, the European leaders then left that call and told everybody that they'd spoken to Trump. They didn't tell us that they were talking to a sleepy Trump, and that Trump had endorsed fully their position and was ready and set to impose the bone-crunching sanctions if the Russians didn't agree to the ultimatum to accept the ceasefire, the unconditional ceasefire, on Monday. Now, if all of that is true, if Sean Walker is right about this, then it looks as if the Europeans not only were trying to bounce Trump into agreeing, signing off on these bone-crunching sanctions, but as if they were misrepresenting in public Trump's position by saying that he had committed himself to agree sanctions, which he never did. Now, I have to say, if that is true, then Trump, who doesn't, I think, take kindly to being manipulated in this way, nobody ever does, by the way, but I'm sure that Trump doesn't. I can well imagine that Trump must have been inwardly furious, and that might very well explain some of his reactions over the last couple of days. His enthusiastic acceptance of Putin's proposal for direct talks with Ukraine on Thursday, his categorical insistence that the Ukrainians attend the talks, his general welcome of the talks and of the way that they have happened, and his intensely relaxed response to the fact that Putin himself didn't turn up to attend the talks, as Zelensky absurdly suggested, and also the way in which Trump is now talking about a possible summit meeting between Putin and himself to basically resolve the conflict. It could be that Trump is indeed very, very angry, but that he is angry with Merz, Macron, Starmer, and Tusk, and of course Zelensky, and not with Putin, because of the way they tried to maneuver him in to signing off on sanctions in ways that Trump himself never agreed to do. Now, this is all from Sean Walker, and one has to be a bit careful here, because there is one piece of evidence that might arguably argue against this, and that is the post that Trump published on Truth Social, which I've discussed many times and in several places, which appeared on Thursday of last week, in which Trump did seem to float at least the possibility that the United States and its allies, in other words the Europeans, would move forward with sanctions if there wasn't either a ceasefire or negotiations. It was unclear which. Maybe the Europeans seized on that post and tried to, as I said, propel Trump further than he intended towards sanctions, or perhaps the story is more complicated than Sean Walker knows. To say it straightforwardly, I suspect there's been an awful lot of discussion and things going on behind the scenes, which of course we have no idea about. Anybody, those of us who are not involved, have no idea about. And I'm sure that there's been much more toing and froing and discussion and contacts between everybody, Americans and Russians, Americans and Europeans, Europeans and Ukrainians, than we can guess, than I can guess. But anyway, I set this all out. Anyway, there we go. So the Europeans are very, very gloomy. They don't know what to do. Apparently, in fact, not apparently, there was another call to Trump, as far as I can make out, by the same gaggle of European leaders, plus Zelensky from Tirana. They found Trump completely unreceptive to the idea of announcing sanctions against Russia, given that direct negotiations are now underway and that the Ukrainians have agreed to a further meeting in June. Really doesn't seem any sense in that. The Europeans are now starting to lose hope that Trump is in fact going to announce further sanctions. And I think my sense is that the Europeans are perhaps for the first time starting to say to themselves that the game is lost, that Trump will never do what they want him to do. He will never break with the Russians. He will never impose the sanctions. He will never fully recommit to Ukraine. That all attempts to try to tie him down, to corner him, to try to get him to do that are going to fail. And that as a result, because of Trump's stance, Project Ukraine is about to fail also. As I said, I understand that is the general mood in Europe at the moment. It is despondent and gloomy. Nobody apparently knows what to do. They're wringing their hands and apparently complaining to each other. No doubt some people are coming up with all kinds of ideas. They don't really expect more big American arms packages to Ukraine. They've now realized that there is no real prospect of Europe filling up, making the difference, of getting more weapons to Ukraine to compensate for the weapons the Americans aren't providing. And as I said, it may be, and I want to stress this is heavily qualified, but it may be, and judging from some of the news reports, that the EU, the Europeans, the British, the Germans, the French, Starmer, Macron, Merz, are finally coming close to that point when they realise that they have lost. Lost not just this current diplomatic tussle, but the entire game. That the Russians are going to win either through negotiations or on the battlefield, and that there is nothing they can do now to prevent it. So anyway, I may be wrong, and it's also important to say that, this may be the mood in Europe today, but it was next week, human nature being what it is, it may be that somebody else might come up with some wonderful new great plan which they hope or think is going to turn everything round, and then hope might then restart. But I do get the sense that some great line at the moment has been crossed. In Europe, I should stress. Now, about great plans and the way great plans can go horribly astray, I have to say that I read, and I confess, with something of a chuckle, an article which appeared in the Financial Times. It reads how Ukraine lost hundreds of millions on arms deals gone wrong. Now, many of you may remember that I think it was back in 2023, President Pavel of the Czech Republic came up with a plan to buy shells, artillery shells, on the international arms market for Ukraine. The European Union assigned to him 5 billion euros to buy these shells. And I predicted at the time that this was a disastrous idea, that the international arms merchants and all of these people would be rubbing their hands with delight, that the end result of this project, of this plan, would be that the Czechs would indeed place contracts for shells, but never as many shells as they were hoping for, because the arms dealers would inevitably jack up their prices, that some of the shells that the Czechs thought they were buying would be shells that exist only in the imagination, and that some of the shells that were eventually provided would be defective and would turn out to be duds. Well, over the next couple of months, about a year, articles started to appear in the media confirming that very thing. And this was a huge embarrassment. And I noticed some months ago that there were some attempts, some very unconvincing attempts, from people in the Czech Republic, to pretend that President Pavel's great plan to buy shells on the international arms market, well, that they'd actually turned out well after all. You can believe that if you wish. If you do, well, I have a bridge to sell you. That's all I would say. Anyway, this article in the Financial Times is about an entirely different but rather similar project. And it seems that the Ukrainians spent 770 million, I think it was dollars, or it might have been pounds, but anyway, it was dollars, $770 million buying weapons on the international arms market. The article makes, by the way, a very interesting admission that at the time when the special military operation began in February 2022, Ukraine only had shells for about 2 weeks of fighting. So we can be sure that there must have been massive deliveries of shells to Ukraine from the Western powers in the very first days of the war to get Ukraine through, because it is inconceivable that Ukraine could have obtained the shells it needed in any other way. But anyway, Ukraine went on a shopping expedition, spending $770 million to buy arms on the international arms market. There is no explanation here, by the way, in this article about how Ukraine, which is a bankrupt country, found this money. The short answer, of course, is that it was provided by Western, American and European taxpayers. So we're talking about American and European taxpayers' money. Just saying. Anyway, $770 million, and, well, it all went horribly wrong. And the subtitle, I'm not going to read the whole article, it's quite funny in places. The whole article tells us about how the Ukrainians encountered, as one does when one goes on shopping expeditions of this kind with large amounts of money in one's pocket. They encountered all sorts of interesting and plausible people in all kinds of interesting places. You can find details of some of these people in this article. Anyway, they came along, all kinds of deals were done, and, well, some weapons were obtained, but, to go to the subtitle, desperate to source munitions, Kiev paid foreign brokers for weapons and shells that were sometimes unusable or never arrived. The word never arrived the words never arrived are very elegant. That never existed might be more an accurate description, I suspect, of the realities. But you can go to the article yourself and draw your own conclusions. As I said, the international arms market is absolutely not for the faint-hearted. You will find all sorts of interesting people there. And as I said, they can see a sucker coming from a distance, and you can imagine the delight with which this person is received. The article does, by the way, say that it wasn't just these interesting people that the Ukrainian buyers found around the world. It's not impossible that some of the money, the $770 million, vanished in Ukraine itself because of the well-known problems accounting for money which exist there. Anyway, it's an interesting article. I would not be surprised, just saying, if over the next couple of weeks, if American arms supplies really did start to wind down, if we start to see more projects of this kind, with, of course, the identical outcome. Anyway, moving on. There's probably another factor, another reason why the Europeans are apparently in a gloomy and despondent mood, because it seems that the White House and the Pentagon is now telling the Europeans that the United States is about to conduct a major drawdown of military forces, US military forces from Europe. It's not clear to me whether only a proportion of these forces are being withdrawn or whether all of them are. Somewhat to my surprise, some of the reports suggest that all of them are. I can't quite believe that, not at this stage. But I noticed that the American officials who are passing on this information to the Europeans about this drawdown of American forces from Europe are also coming and telling the Europeans that they did have no concern that United States is going to remain fully committed to NATO, that it continues to be a big ally. Now, when assurances of that kind have to be given, that suggests that the drawdown of American forces from Europe is expected to be very significant indeed. Now, to repeat again, this is not because the United States has gone soft. It is not because the United States is giving up its geopolitical position. It is because the United States faces a resource crisis. President Trump and his officials are talking up the fact that recruitment into the US military has now finally started to pick up again. But even if it recovers fully to the position that it was, the United States is still massively overextended in many places. And given that it has decided that China is the main challenger, what appears to be happening is a reshuffling of American forces from Europe to the Asia-Pacific region. Now, from a European perspective, they're not going to like that at all. They want the Americans to stay. I've discussed this in many programs. They want the Americans to stay because they rely on the Americans to keep the Russians at bay. They rely on the Americans to keep pressure on the Russians. The Europeans probably sense that in any future negotiations with the Russians on, say, energy issues, or even simple things like fishing quotas and things of that kind, they will be in a significantly weaker position if they don't have the American superpower fully behind them. So the Europeans will not like that at all. And besides, when they get reassurances that the United States remains fully committed to NATO and is still a firm ally, more likely than not, that is going to trigger some European concerns that the very fact that the Americans are saying that may be a sign that in fact they are reconsidering their commitment to NATO and that they're not such a firm ally after all. So one could see why the Europeans are worried about this. And they are worried by something else. And again, this is openly discussed in the European media. They're very concerned now about the possibility of a summit meeting between Putin and Trump. And Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has been talking about this, and he says that absolutely such a meeting is necessary. It must take place. Not quite yet. There still needs to be a lot of work done in order to prepare for that meeting. But in a way, for the Europeans, that is even more alarming because it suggests that the Russians are planning an expansive agenda for this meeting, including maybe a re-examination of the security situation and the security architecture in Europe. And the Europeans must worry that Trump and the administration, because they want to refocus on Asia and the Pacific, might be tempted to agree to some of the things that the Russians want. So one could understand the gloom and the nervousness in Europe at this time. Now, I have to say this, they do have a way out. Now, Michael Fondonder Schulenberg, German diplomat, UN official, a person who's given advice, a member of the European Parliament also, I should say, person who's worked with the BSW in Germany, a voice of reason and sanity on foreign policy for a very, very long time. He has recently, I noticed, been to Moscow. He was there for the Victory Day celebrations. He emphatically did not attend, I should make this clear, the parade on Red Square, but he did visit Moscow. He did speak to various Russian officials. From what I understand, he spoke to ordinary Russians as well. And he and the group of MPs, European MPs, of which he was part, issued certain statements which you can track down and find. I find them very moving and very important, by the way, in which Schulenberg and the others make the point that in Russia you find none of the anger and hysteria and vindictiveness, if I have to say it, towards the Europeans that you find on the part of the Europeans towards the Russians. Now, that is actually very astonishing, given the amount of abuse and language that has been used by the European leadership, and which continues to be used by the European leadership about Russia. Friedrich Merz, as I said, the Chancellor of Germany, made a speech in which he talked about the Russians committing barbaric acts, for example. But the Russians have never reciprocated in anything like the same way. It could be because they're winning the war. And of course, if you're winning the war, You don't have to use this hysterical and shrill language. Or it could be because there's aspects of the Russian character that work against them acting in this way. Or it could be because, and this is probably the most likely explanation, because they're taking their cue from the Kremlin itself, which has notably avoided stooping to this kind of rhetoric. When I discussed Putin's comments, his speech to the journalists, the one that he made on Saturday, the one in which he announced Russia's intention to send a negotiating team to Istanbul on Thursday, I made the point that he was very careful to avoid using any of the language about the Ukrainians or about the Europeans that the Europeans and the Ukrainians use about Russia and about him. The nearest he has come to in terms of outright, abuse, insults, that kind of thing, was a couple of days ago when, over the course of an economics meeting, he said that the European leaders were idiots to think about imposing further sanctions on Russia, which would only backfire against them and worsen the conditions of life of their own people. Well, idiots is very strong, and it does give one a sense of what Putin thinks about these people, but it falls far, far short of what the Western leaders routinely say about him. Anyway, put that aside, Schulenberg found that the Russians are absolutely open to contacts with the Europeans, that they take a very calm response. They have a very calm response to all that has been towards all that has been happening. He says that he didn't encounter any hostility, nor did his group, whilst they were in Russia. And, well, I think that European leaders, if they were wise, would build on that. Why do they not do that which Michael Schulenberg, Ian Proud, Jeffrey Sachs, John Mearsheimer, Alex Christoforou, my colleague and friend on the Duran, all of us have been saying, the Russians have also been saying, why don't the Europeans finally, if they feel so gloomy and despondent about the situation, finally pick up the courage, pick up the telephone, call Lavrov or Putin and say, look, we understand that we've now reached this point. We want to meet with you. Will you accept our representative in Moscow? In response to which, there is an absolute certainty that the Russians will say yes. So at that point, the European representative, who, heavens help us, currently is Emmanuel Macron of France, can presumably go to Moscow and talk with the Russians and, well, perhaps see what, if anything, can be done. Isn't that a far more sensible approach? I should add Robert Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky in Britain, as another person who calls for Europe, and the British, by the way, to start doing that kind of thing. Well, of course, they're not going to do it. Not for the moment. Probably they're going to wait further until things get worse for Ukraine, worse for the people of Europe. They will do it only when they have absolutely no choice. And even then, they might try to avoid doing it. Anyway, I'm not going to discuss the military situation today. I was hoping to do so, but obviously we've had more developments. I will try to return to it further in my program tomorrow. But suffice to say that the military situation continues to go very badly for Ukraine. Today, this morning, we got a whole new set of claims that the fortified village of Bogatyr has now fallen completely under Russian control. I think that is likely to be true. We will probably get confirmation of this over the course of the day, and we shall see. It's becoming increasingly clear to me that the Russians almost certainly do have an armed presence inside southern Pokrovsk, though the area is very subject to heavy fighting, and technically it might not be Pokrovsk, it might be some of the outlying villages or supposed villages that in reality do form, as far as I can see, part of the built-up area that ultimately amounts to Pokrovsk. So clearly the Russians are advancing there, and they're advancing in Konstantinovka, around Konstantinovka as well. And Radovka the other day was saying that they now expect that the Ukrainian forces south of Konstantinovka are going to withdraw from their positions and retreat into the urban areas of the town, because to do otherwise would bring upon them their own destruction. Syrsky, the Ukrainian military chief, has now finally acknowledged what Brian Beletic and myself and Alex Vashinin and all sorts of others have been saying for years, that Russia is waging a war of attrition against Ukraine, which is obviously true. He didn't say that the Russians are winning the war of attrition, though they obviously are. But anyway, as I said, the military situation continues to deteriorate for Ukraine. I am going to just quickly say one further thing, that I still have significant doubts about whether the Russians have indeed established bridgeheads on the west bank of the Dnieper River. But anyway, I will try, hopefully, to discuss that further in my program tomorrow. Anyway, in the meantime, and just to say this, I will just say a few quick words about the situation in the Middle East. It seems that Israel has now begun another offensive in Gaza. There are reports all across the media now that the Trump administration and the Donald Trump himself have cooled on Israel, that the relationship between Donald Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu has effectively broken down, that Donald Trump conspicuously did not visit Israel during his Middle East trip. He went to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, but he didn't go to Israel. His comments about Israel, whilst in Saudi Arabia, were perhaps less fulsome, certainly a lot less extensive than one might have expected. And there is now a widespread view that even in Europe, or at least also in Europe, and certainly in Britain and France, though I think less so in Germany, the tide of opinion is beginning to turn against Israel. I think that this is probably true. I think that, again, it might be unwise to make too many assumptions about this. In Trump's case, I have no doubt at all that what has annoyed him is Israel's incessant lobbying for an attack on Iran and the revelations that Israel has been able to get its friends within the administration to lobby on its behalf, and that Donald Trump's own national security advisor, Mike Waltz, at one time seemed to be working more closely with the Israelis than he was for the president himself. So it may be that the mood is indeed finally shifting against Israel. And that might be something that the Israeli authorities might, in normal times, notice and act on. I have to say that so far I've not seen anything happen that might constrain Israeli actions. If there is this shift in the mood, then the right place again for it to acquire form would be in the United Nations. Until we actually see Western countries supporting resolutions in the Security Council and in the General Assembly, which require Israel to stop, I will take all of this talk about a change in mood in Europe with a pinch of salt. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say in my program today. I expect that I will be making a program, by the way, tomorrow, a normal program tomorrow, though it might appear earlier than usual, because obviously I'm traveling. And I fully intend to do programs on Monday and Tuesday and for Wednesday. Though, as I said, there may be technical issues that I will need to resolve. And anyway, whatever. So expect my next program, and I will try and keep you all informed about what I'm doing. And in the meantime, I would remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X, and you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.